Do you think it would be realistic to see Russian tanks in Poland and the Czech Republic and the Baltic countries?
Absolutely. I think the way they are working on that is to try to undermine the coherence of NATO and see if they can somehow make NATO collapse. If that happens, then all these countries are going to be left alone. It will be much easier for Russia to deal with it. It will not be dealing with NATO. They will be dealing individually with Lithuania. The Russian efforts here are going to be directed at how can we undermine NATO. And unfortunately, I think it looks like they're doing pretty well on that right now. NATO is in the worst crisis it has ever been right now, with the Trump administration and the biggest military power basically telling everyone else that we're not going to be there for you. That's why I'm so concerned that Russia might challenge Article 5, because that might be one more way to really put pressure on NATO and see if the countries really stand together when it comes to it, or if NATO is going to collapse, which I don't think we can rule out the possibility that is going to happen. Or who knows, maybe the United States are going to take Greenland and they're going to be the new enemy.
What if NATO collapsed? What if Russian tanks rolled into Poland unchecked? Welcome to Mindblowers, the podcast where we unpack the future. In this episode, we sit down with military analyst Anders Puck Nielsen, a man who spent his life studying how wars unfold and why. The world is shifting fast, faster than most people realize. And geopolitics, it hasn't been this unstable since World War II, and that's just the beginning. We dive into the rise of AI-powered warfare, autonomous killer drones, and laser weapons already redefining the battlefield. What happens when war becomes automated? When attrition is decided by algorithms? When entire alliances start to fracture? And power is measured not by troops, but by code. This is the future of warfare. This is Mindblowers. Hi, and welcome to the Mindblowers Podcast. This time we have Anders Puck Nielsen in the studio, who is an expert in warfare and especially on the Ukraine war. Hi, Anders.
Hello.
Well, thank you so much for coming. And well, let's jump straight into it. I'm super curious to talk more about the Ukraine war, and also with a twist on a bit of futurism on kind of how has AI impacted the war and maybe even robotics and lasers in some future. But first, Anders, I'm curious if the West deployed all their most advanced weapons. Do you think Ukraine would win the war in a matter of 1 or 2 years?
I think so, but not because it's more modern weapons, but just because it's more quantity. So I mean, one of the reasons why the war has ended up in this kind of quagmire that it is in is because the West has been very cautious to deliver more capabilities. So I think that's one of the reasons. And therefore, just obviously, if Ukraine was given more technology, it wouldn't necessarily have to be the most modern technology, actually. Very much of what we're talking about that would really make a difference are these long-range missiles that were produced maybe in the 90s, but that would just make a difference if Ukraine had that kind of reach combined with those kinds of warheads. I think the war being sort of on this tipping point where it could go either way right now. I do think that if Ukraine was given the necessary assistance, then yes, they could win the war.
So it sounds like it's kind of a game of not provoking Russia enough for this to escalate, and on the other hand, helping Ukraine enough just not to collapse. Is that correctly seen?
I think that's been the approach of the Biden administration. It's very different now under Trump, but during the Biden era, it was very much about finding that balancing. It was this balancing act where Ukraine was assisted because it would not be permissible that Putin could win this war, and the Biden administration saw that as potentially leading to escalation, that Putin would not stop in Ukraine. He would continue on, and it would escalate into a bigger war in Europe. So giving Ukraine enough weapons that Russia couldn't win, but also a big concern about what can Putin do if he's put under enough pressure. Will he take the nuclear step and all those things, and then all the time making sure not to give Ukraine the weapons they would actually need to decisively put Russia under pressure. So I think there has been this balancing act. And then right now, under Trump, it's a little more difficult to see what his idea is, except for he just wants the war to end. But in terms of the assistance Ukraine is getting, then it's basically just a continuation of what Biden set into action. So it's still Biden's aid package that is being delivered now. Yeah, we haven't seen any new initiatives from Trump about new aid packages that will give new capabilities.
So in terms of end games, I mean, what would Biden's end game then be?
I think the idea was that over time, Russia would just get so tired of this that they would stop attacking. And then that would be how the war would end. So basically, Putin would eventually discover that this is not good for Russia. So let's end it there and find a different way that can be better for Russia in the long term. I think that was Biden's idea, that just Putin will get to his senses. And we can say that Trump basically has the same idea, that it should be obvious to Putin that this is a bad idea, so he should just stop attacking, and then the war is over. I think it's a very naive way to look at what the Russians are doing, and unfortunately, I think we are in this for a longer, it's a longer perspective here, and Russia is really fighting for great power status. And if they just stop fighting where it is right now, then from a Russian perspective, they actually lost the war. So they have to keep going until they fundamentally manage to change the architecture of security in Europe, where they will have this great power status going forward. And that requires them to keep fighting, at least for now.
I asked ChatGPT if we set the Russian kind of military power at index 100 before the war, what would it be now? It said it would probably be somewhere around 65. Do you agree with that assessment?
It's hard to say. Also, how do you measure these kinds of things? But definitely, I would say that when we look at the Russian army that is fighting today in Ukraine, then it's not the same army that attacked Ukraine in 2022. So they have lost so much equipment that today they are fighting without many of the capabilities they had. But on the other hand, there has also been innovation. So they are fighting with drones, for example, that did not exist in 2022. In terms of manpower, the Russian army has actually grown. So the Russian army is bigger today than it was in 2022. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say exactly in terms of numbers like that, but I would think that 65% is too low. I think we would be higher, but definitely there is an important point in asking questions like this, which is that you very rarely win the war with the army that you begin the war with, and I think there is a danger in some of the military analysis being done right now, where we in the West look at what do the Russians have, what do we have, and we make comparisons based on what we have today without thinking it through, that if there actually is a war between us and them, for example, then this would probably be a long war where we would basically lose all the things we have, and what will determine the outcome of the war in the end is what can we build during the war. So in many respects, the Russian army is fighting with their second or their third army during this war, because everyone has been replaced and the equipment they have today is not the same they had.
But maybe they have also learned a lot. and more ready for a second war? What do you think?
I think so. And the technological innovation has been very dramatic during the war, and the Russians have been there, and we haven't. So I think that's an important perspective here. I think there is a tendency to underestimate what they can do, but because we look at what are they doing, why is it so hard for them to take the next small town or what have you, that we 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 don't quite understand what it is they're doing and how we would do differently, right? We have pictures of what maneuver warfare should look like, and uh, we would, think that, well, they should be operating this way with tanks and combined arms, with fighter aircraft and all kinds of things that should work together here, because that's our standard for what good military operations should look like. But in reality, there has been a technological development on the front line that just means that this type of warfare is actually the warfare of yesterday. And if we don't wake up to that reality, then we would be in for a very, very bad experience on the battlefield if we were to meet this Russian army that we make fun of because they use donkeys for logistics and these things, but they actually know how to operate in this environment where there are all the drones, and they have the skilled drone pilots, and we don't. So I think it's important that we don't underestimate what they're doing. And just to be clear, there is absolutely no army in Europe, except for the Ukrainian one, that would be able to fight the way the Russians are now in year 4 of a large-scale war. We would not have been able to do the same as the Russians are doing now.
Interesting. So if the Ukraine war had happened, let's say 15 years ago, how different do you think it would have been fought, and how different would the outcome have been?
Um, I mean, there are many political differences as well. Ukraine is a very different country today than they were in 2010. And we can say it was actually fought, at least partially, in 2014 and 15, right? But I think just from a technological point of view, it's hard to it's hard to overestimate the consequences of the drone development. And um, this has what this has done is that it has enabled smaller military powers to do attrition warfare at scale, because of this new technology, things are very cheap, and you can mass produce these types of weapons, very easily in people's basements. And you don't need these huge production lines. You don't need these very, very expensive high-tech equipment to be able to fight this kind of warfare. And that's why we end up, ironically, this modern technology has meant that from a military point of view, this suddenly looks like World War I, where you have this trench warfare again. And that's mostly because of the drones. So I think it would have been a very different war 15 years ago, a war where the standards of maneuver warfare would have been much more evident, and the Russians probably would have been in a better position because they had more tanks, they had more fighter aircraft, they had these things that would have enabled that type of warfare.
Interesting. So, like, if you should look at the different weapons being deployed, and you would kind of go like, this has turned out to be overrated, and this has turned out to be underrated. I mean, apparently it seems like drones have been underrated, but what about other types of weapons?
Yeah, drones have been underrated, and the interesting thing is also that this is a type of weapon that really did not exist when the war started. So it's something that has also been invented during the war. And we can say the types of drones that existed when it started, there was a lot of talk about these Turkish TB2 Bayraktar drones, for example, these very big ones that became very famous in the early weeks of the war. We don't hear about those anymore, right? So I think that's an example of something that was overrated at that point in time. The other things we could say, I think the tank was probably overrated when this began, because it just turned out that tanks are very vulnerable on the modern battlefield. There are really many things that can destroy a tank. Um, so some of these, um, we could say the fighter jets, maybe also. I mean, both sides have been able to basically deny the other side access to the front line with aircraft. So air power on along the front line today is the drones. It's not the fighter aircraft.
And how is that possible? I mean, it just seems that like a fighter jet would be able to fly much higher, and obviously can carry much more dangerous weapons. But can the drones simply shoot down the fighter jets?
Not the drones, but that would be different types of air defense systems, or the enemy's fighter jets. But there are many different types of air defense systems, and that actually touches on something else that's been really important, which is the ranges of modern weapons, how far they can shoot today. That is also something that has dramatically changed how warfare is being fought. That it used to be that if you had just some distance from the front line, just say 30 kilometers from the front line, that would be outside of artillery range. You would be pretty safe. Today, that's not the case anymore. Both sides have these weapons that can shoot hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. And that's the same thing also with air defense systems, and why it's possible to keep the enemy's jets at a distance. Also because they're so expensive that if you lose a fighter jet, that's a big loss. So you have to be careful. And one of the interesting things that have happened is also that this modern technology of the drones, the unmanned systems, the killer robots, uh, they have been combined with very old-fashioned types of weapons, like the personnel mines, for example, or old-fashioned artillery, and they have made these older types of weapons more effective. You can use them in a much more clever way when you have drones hanging overhead and giving this very clear image of what's going on and where is the enemy and what are they doing. And so it just increases the efficiency of other types of old weapon systems. So we can say they have been old weapon systems have been underrated in this war, and have really demonstrated that old weapons still kill.
And what about ships?
Um, yeah, the ships. This is one of those things where we can say it's a bit the same, where some of these modern as with the tank. I mean, so we have these big battleship or warships that have really demonstrated that they are extremely vulnerable to this unmanned technology. So there's been a huge development in maritime drones on the Ukrainian side, and it has really challenged the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is, before the full-scale invasion was much stronger than the Ukrainian Navy, but still have been unable to operate freely for the last couple of years because of the development of this unmanned technology. And just, again, the asymmetry in that, for Ukraine, it's not super important that every drone makes, makes a successful attack, right? It's okay if Russia is able to defend against 9 out of 10 of these drones, right? But so we can say the drones just have to be lucky ones, but the manned warship with a crew of maybe 200 soldiers, they have to be lucky every time. And that's the asymmetry here, and why it has made it basically impossible for the Russians to use these warships. And it's a conundrum. We don't know how to solve this problem from a maritime warfare perspective. Because right now it's Ukraine that operates these things, but in 10 years' time, it's going to be everyone in the world that has these maritime drones. And what will that mean for our ability to do expeditionary naval operations, for example. So definitely we are seeing the challenge from unmanned systems there as well.
If we look, let's say, 5 years ahead in time, how do you think the Ukraine war, if it continues, will look different? Will we see more maybe robots deployed? I'm thinking about Terminator-style robots, instead of troops. Will we see lasers? Could we see, other types of drones than we're seeing right now? Maybe like drone swarms that we've seen in some movies.
Yeah, all these things are under development. We can say the lasers are already deployed in some places and being used for air defense. It's a very good system for shooting down enemy drones, for example, or incoming missiles and these things. So that's the idea, that you can use lasers for that. Instead of shooting things down with missiles, you can shoot it down with lasers. The challenge with lasers is that you need so much energy that you basically have to have your own power plant next to this laser, right? So it's not something that you could easily build into a drone, for example, that will shoot laser beams like Star Wars kinds of, it's something that's very stationary right now, and the range is not super great. But it's definitely something that is coming. The drone swarms as well. We're already seeing that, and it's one of those developments happening right now where more and more drones become able to coordinate their actions in air and to communicate about attacking some target. We are seeing a lot of that is right now happening with the development of what we can call motherships, where you have a big drone that can sort of release a bunch of smaller drones that actually do the kill. There is a constant battle over the electronics spectrum. So what is called electronic warfare is really important. And it's this thing about how do you jam the frequencies that the enemy uses while you keep the frequencies open that you use. And, in time and space, how do you make it impossible for the enemy to operate during that time slot when you plan your attack and those things. So this is going on constantly all the time, very rapid development. Something that's very big and that I think would happen if this continues for another 5 years is that I think we would see the ground drones. We would see much of that development that has been happening in flying drones will also be happening on the ground. I don't think they would be necessarily walking like Terminator kinds of robots, but sort of remote controlled vehicles that can solve different tasks on the ground. I think that's really something that's coming within the coming years, and the Ukrainians have an ambition of removing more and more soldiers from the front line and have robots taking over that task, which is the most dangerous one. So I guess ultimately we're approaching a time when there are no soldiers at all in the front line, and it's just robots fighting against each other there. But so that's something that's really happening a lot right now. One of the very big challenges about having these robots operating is how do you distinguish between different types of targets? For example, how do you make something it would be fairly easy to have a robot with a machine gun and then just train to shoot, identify a human being and then shoot at that. But how do you distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians, for example? And you have all these challenges. So I think in the beginning, it's not going to be really fighting robots like that, but it would be different tasks, logistics, mine laying, mines, sort of mine hunting, these things. That's very much under development right now. Evacuation of wounded, also something.
But how autonomous do you think warfare can become? I mean, I listened to this guy, Palmer Luckey. I don't know how familiar you are with him. So he's like a former tech guy who sold Oculus Rift to Facebook. And then Facebook kicked him out because he was supporting Trump before Facebook started and Zuckerberg started to support Trump. And he has this company, let me just see here. It's called Anduril or something like that. And so he's talking a lot about like autonomous warfare, and he's given examples of for example, if China were to attack Taiwan, like if you had a truly autonomous, it's called Anduril, his company. And so he talked a lot about like, if the US stay ahead and are truly autonomous in the way drones are operated, then that would be a major advantage. How much do you think it matters to kind of make that shift?
I mean, it's an inevitable development, I think, because everyone wants, if you can have your weapons fight for themselves and not put any of your soldiers in harm's way, then that's definitely better. And there are a lot of ethical considerations about this, and I touched on it before about how much decision making can we delegate to a robot about who to kill and who gets to live and who dies, right? Is these kinds of ethical decisions, and there are also decisions about humanitarian international law and those things about it. But technologically, that is the way that things are going. Um, One of the very big challenges that we're going to be facing is that this technology on overall tends to favor the defender. So um, I think the big challenge for the defense industry of our time is to find out how do we still conduct offensive operations in this type of drone saturated environment. Because we cannot, I mean, if we go into a period of time where it's not possible to actually achieve anything and we can't engage in any type of offensive operations, then it will be, that would be, it would be difficult, let's say that, to um to exercise power in any kind of way. uh a lot of the if we just take the what how is NATO planning on conducting operations, a lot of it is right now based on an assumption that if Russia were to attack a NATO country, for example, then NATO would be able to reinforce or to set up this force and then go and liberate that country. But in an environment where the technology to that extent favors the defender, then you might very quickly run into a kind of fait accompli situation where it's just not possible, it's not feasible to liberate a country that has been occupied, right? Because the enemy will be able to build these very, very strong defensive lines. So it would be the same thing about, you know, um, other conflicts, Korea scenario, or you run into so there is a very big challenge here. If we can't conduct offensive operations in the future, then we will have to focus on being ready to fight all wars defensively, and that will require much more capabilities, many more soldiers actually being present constantly on the potential front line, because we can't afford to lose even the first kilometer, because we'll probably never be able to take it back. So I think that's one of the big challenges, figuring out how can we still conduct offensive operations in this type of environment.
So if we take the thought experiment that the Ukraine war ends, for example, and um, Russia, as much as possible, make a shock and surprise move to occupy the Baltic countries, I guess via the Luckey Gap or something like that, um, then NATO would have a problem in terms of liberating if they allowed Russia to first occupy.
Yes, that is true. I mean, um, if Russia first takes the Baltic countries, it would be almost impossible to liberate them again. So that's why NATO has to adjust and have a much more forceful presence so that that doesn't happen. And Russia is stopped very quickly after crossing the front line, right? And of course, um, if we look at the size of the NATO Russia border today, then we also have all of Finland, and that would be really difficult. But especially in the Baltic states, that is a danger because of the nature of this modern technology. That this idea that we can go and liberate these countries again is just not really that feasible. We would have to put some kind of other pressure on Russia so that they would be willing to leave voluntarily, but that might be difficult.
Okay. So that means that kind of the deterrent against occupying other countries needs to be kind of different, because I guess nuclear weapons will kind of be out of the scope anyway, right? Because that normally would mean the end of the world, I'm guessing. So what does that look like? Does that look like NATO having a big troop presence in countries where either China or the Russia could consider invading, or is it more of like an automated drone reaction that is needed?
Mm. Yeah, usually we would talk about deterrence in two ways. So there's the pillar of deterrence by punishment, which is the threat of nuclear weapons. That okay, you might be able to occupy this country, but then you're going to be hit with nuclear weapons, so it's your choice, right? So that's one thing, and there the challenge is that there is the political challenge that NATO's nuclear weapons are mostly American nuclear weapons. And there is this whole question of, with the Trump administration, how much can we trust the Americans to be willing to start a nuclear war with Russia over one of the Baltic states, for example? Trump might say, I can't do that because I have other considerations that I think are more important, right? Um, So that's deterrence by punishment, and that is weakened right now because of the political instability inside of NATO, and the question of where is America and all this. And then there's the other pillar, which is deterrence by denial, which is that you have a strong forward presence. That means that it's very, very difficult for the enemy to achieve their goals. And I think that's what we will have to look more into, deterrence by denial, which will mean a strong forward presence, so that it's evident that Russia can't actually occupy the Baltic states, that they will be stopped within the first few kilometers of crossing the border and just end in a quagmire as they have in Ukraine right now. And if they are convinced that that is going to be the consequence of an attack, then they will probably not go for it. So that's I think that's what the European countries will have to focus on: strong deterrence by denial. But yeah, um, it's going to require significant investments, and it's going to require all kinds of political things. But I think militarily, that's going to be the solution to this.
And what would that look like? Is that a drone defense, or is it a missile defense, or a combination?
Yeah, I think it's about taking the lessons that Ukraine has learned about this and implementing those things on the front line, but then adding on top of that some of the capabilities that Ukraine is missing. So that's, for example, some of the very long range um, capabilities, such as the missiles that we've been told. There's a lot of talk about the German Taurus missile and the Storm Shadow missile and those things, and also some of the air power that Europe, after all, has some fighter jets, some air power there that Ukraine does not have. But it's very much about taking the lessons that they have learned, especially about drone warfare, and what it requires, and then having that on in the Baltic states or in Finland, and being ready, and having soldiers with us that are ready for that. But also, we need to understand that our standards of maneuver warfare will not, that's not how the next war will be fought. And unfortunately, it seems to me that many military officers in NATO still are kind of stuck in this old paradigm. of what the war will look like, and we look at the Russians and we see they don't do coordinated maneuver warfare as we think it should look, and therefore they are not good. When in reality, it's probably them who would have the advantage if it came to a confrontation. So there's a mental thing there as well. Um, but just to put this into perspective, Ukraine's ambition this year is to produce 4.5 million drones. Last year it was 1.5 million drones. So in 2024, 1.5. This year, 4.5 million drones. I don't remember what it was in 2023, but it was probably in a few 100,000, I think. So this has been exponential growth in the application of drones, right? And um, I think I made the calculation that this is about 12,000 drones every day that Ukraine uses on the front line here in 2025. And the Russians, of course, use something similar. So that's just to show how saturated the environment is. So we're going to have to focus on getting that capability to build that kind of quantity. And we need to figure out how can we be innovative and how can we have these rapid development cycles where, because the drones that are built today, in three months from now, they don't work anymore because Russian electronic warfare will have figured out ways to target those drones. So you need to constantly move and innovate and change. And as soon as the enemy finds some countermeasure, you need to adapt to that and come up with something different. So we need to somehow be ready for that as well. And hopefully we will be able to leverage the Ukrainian defense industry in this. But that, of course, depends on how they will be coming out of on this war on the other side.
So I can't help to think about China here. If I understand it correctly, China are number one when it comes to production of drones. So maybe not military drones, I don't know about that, but at least like the private drones. If China kind of entered the war or more officially decided to support Russia with drones, would that be a significant game changer in the war?
I mean, yeah, it could be. Yeah. China is already supporting Russia in different ways. They are really helpful in trying to help Russia circumvent the sanctions, for example. So make sure that Russia still has access to the components they need to build these things. But obviously, China can deliver equipment to Russia that will make them able to fight the war even better than they already are. I just heard some numbers the other day that Russia only produces about 30% of the artillery shells that they use, for example. About 60% of the artillery shells they use are produced in North Korea and about 10% in Iran. So that just shows how dependent Russia actually is on also weapons assistance from foreign countries. It's not just Ukraine that receives assistance from abroad. And of course, if China were to enter this and really go in on the side of Russia and deliver all the things that they could dream of, that would make a significant difference. I will say, though, I mean, I'm not sure they would necessarily make that much of a difference in terms of drones, because I think they already provide most of the technology that Russia needs to build and innovate in this space. And I would actually think the Chinese are quite busy trying to learn from the Russian experiences here and seeing how they need to adapt. Because they can, of course, also see the significance of what's going on.
So looking a little bit more at what actually matters in this war, I mean, I'm quite surprised that people are still talking about F-16 fighters. I think I bought a game when I was like, I don't know, 12 years old about an F-16 fighter. And when we did warfare on the computer back then, it was also about troop deployment and tanks. But I mean, tanks apparently are overrated, but we still talk a lot about troops and numbers in terms of soldiers, and we've talked a lot about the F-16s. How is that possible? It sounds so, 1950, really.
Hmm. Yeah, well, the irony is that while there has been this dramatic technological development in terms of drone warfare and how they are being operated, you see a lot of implementation of new technology here. Um, some of the fascinating things is that you also see how the role of the drone pilot, for example, is something specific. It's a unique capability to have good drone pilots, and who are good drone pilots is very often people who have a background from gaming, and a lot of work is being put into trying to gamify the gamification of drone warfare, how you can earn points when you kill the enemy and those kinds of things, and you can actually get benefits if with those points that you earn in this drone game and these kinds of things. So on the one hand, there's a lot coming in from the tech industry to this, but the irony is that on a bigger scale, what this has done is that it has shifted warfare back to the kind of attritional warfare that was the trench warfare of the First World War. And that's why the casualty numbers have skyrocketed as a consequence of this. Um, the casualty numbers are just mind blowing in this conflict, and that is really the consequence of what I said, that this technology really favors the defender. That if you want to achieve anything offensively, you have to be willing to take those kinds of casualties. And I think maybe that's also one of our biggest weaknesses in Western Europe, that I don't think we are mentally prepared for warfare to be that, take that kind of toll. And how long would we be willing to fight a war while taking those kinds of casualties? Um, how long would it take before the cohesion in NATO would start breaking apart, right? And some countries would start saying, "Is it really worth it?" Right? I mean, Russia's not threatening our country. Why would Why would so many of our soldiers need to die or be wounded to defend Latvia, right? Um, and I think that's perhaps our biggest weakness, that we would not be willing to continue doing that, that we would have a lot of high-tech equipment on day one, and that would work well the first 7 or 8 weeks of the war, but, like, what are we gonna fight the war with on, day 200? Or, and will we be willing to take those kinds of casualties? Um Yeah, so it's a kind of strange thing where on the one hand, it's very high tech, it's very inspired by this modern technology, the internet, the computer games, and all that. But on the other hand, the consequence is that warfare has also dialed the clock back more than 100 years, and we have to understand war in those terms suddenly.
Is there a way out of this in terms of technological development? I mean, what I'm thinking is, if everything's become more autonomous and we get these land drones, or what we should call them, could we imagine wars with minimal casualties in the future?
I think that will be hard because and one of the big challenges with this is that it is so cheap to produce this capability that everyone will have it, right? We were lucky when we were fighting in Afghanistan that the Taliban did not have a drone air force, right? But today they would have. So just thinking about how would we fight something like the Afghanistan war today, I think that would be very, very difficult to do because this is technology that enables everyone to have an air force. And um, yeah, as I said, this is the challenge of the uh, for the defense industry for the coming decades. I think they will probably come up with different kinds of solutions. I think we're going to see a lot of drones fighting drones kinds of solutions to this. We will have you will have your own defensive drone swarm with you when you go anywhere, because that's what you need to defend against the enemy's drone swarm. And we will have these kinds of things. One of the yeah, these kinds of developments are taking place all the time, and people are trying to find different ways to deal with the fact that this technology now exists. You have measure, countermeasure, this kind of game. Um, so that will continue, but right now I'm a bit pessimistic about it because of the just price matters in this, and suddenly all kinds of actors that didn't used to be able to afford an air force or to be able to afford attrition warfare, now suddenly they can. And that means that the benefits we got used to having, we were used to being able to fight with technological superiority, and that is what has enabled things like the war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and those things. That advantage is not so clear anymore. And to some extent, that's probably just something we need to accept and then try to deal with as best as possible.
So do you think this changes the geopolitical balance of power going forward?
It will definitely make it more difficult to engage in what we could call casual wars. Like, if we take something like the Afghanistan war, for example, it was not something that directly influenced most people in European countries, right? But today it would be a much bigger commitment because we would just be facing much higher casualty numbers. So our politicians need to be able to, or need to think this through in a different way. They really need determination before they commit our soldiers to those kinds of expeditionary operations. But on the other hand, it's probably also going to create a bigger pressure for doing it in one way or another. If we take some of these things happening in Africa, for example, where you have different militias that are terrorizing the local populations and those things, they're going to be doing that with drones pretty soon, and that will again elevate this terror to an entirely new level, and create more pressures to engage in different places.
How do you think it impacts the risk of terrorism in the West?
Hmm. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously something that we will probably see some terrorist organization trying to leverage this kind of technology. Um, so we will need different systems to protect against that. But I don't know. We haven't really seen it so much yet. But I mean, it's definitely something that for example, airports or need to be very conscious about. How do we actually make sure that our infrastructure still works in a time when it's very easy to fly these things? How do we discover when it happened and um, be able to one way or another have different systems that make it difficult, that can take them down?
I mean, kind of what I'm thinking, it might be difficult to get a number of drones into a Western country, but what about like airplanes? I guess they seem quite vulnerable, right? If you are a terrorist organization that want to take down
Uh,
civilian aircrafts, maybe in like close proximity to countries like, I don't know, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. I mean, this could be European flights flying into these countries and out of these countries. Do you think that would be a new way of terrorism we'll see?
Maybe in general, it's really difficult to hit a moving target. Um, so when you have these kamikaze drones that are being used, these very long range ones, for example, that both Russia and Ukraine are using, they are very good at hitting something stationary like a factory or an oil refinery or a particular building, like these things, where you can just take the coordinate off Google Maps and then you can plot that into the drone. Hitting something that is moving requires a lot more. So I think it would be difficult to hit aircraft in the air. But it's, I mean, sure. I mean, I guess with AI and all these things coming, but that will remove much of what makes this dangerous, namely the fact that it's affordable. Um, but we can see them target the airports, for example, or uh, government buildings, or all kinds of things. We just saw how scared the Russians were when they had the May 9th parade, because what if there is one of these Ukrainian drones suddenly flying over Red Square, right? And that was not impossible. Today they have these. I'm pretty sure that they, you know, the air over the Kremlin was so saturated with electronic warfare that you couldn't actually. There was no radio wave that was going to get through there, but you could have those with the fiber optic cables, for example, that are kind of dragging a long wire behind them, and then you do all the communication with the drone through that. Yeah, that is resistance to jamming. So it just shows that this is something that we need to take into consideration in the future, and we don't fully understand the consequences of that yet. But yeah.
But do you think we'll see a world where different types of regimes will be more at liberty to do as they like? I mean, if they have a small, weak neighbor that they want to invade, that they can quite easily calculate, we invade them, it will take us a week. If the Americans or Europeans or Chinese wanted to react, or Russia, they wouldn't do it because the cost-benefit ratio has shifted drastically.
I think that is where we're going. Yes, that it will be more difficult for to do these types of expeditionary warfare with a fairly light footprint, where you the wars of choice that we can say that, those where we did not have to go to Afghanistan. It was something we decided to do because there was some kind of political goal we wanted to achieve, right? But this definitely changes the calculus here, right? With the commitment is going to be much bigger, and we will be facing bigger casualties in this, and that obviously will leave a bigger room for maneuver for other actors to bully their neighbors, because, well, nobody's probably going to do anything. Um, and you can do things like long range strikes or things like that. Try to leverage some of that technology, but it is limited what you can actually achieve with that. So I do think you are right, and that is one of the reasons why we're moving into a world that is going to be more unstable, and there are going to be more conflicts and those things. All that is also driven by the technology, and also by other factors like the political developments in the world, but technology definitely plays a role.
So if you were going to try to predict a bit more about like how will this develop, like um, how do you see the Ukraine war ending, and what do you think the takeaway will be from countries such as Russia and China once it has ended?
I think it's still an open question how it's going to end. Uh, and I think the takeaways are going to be very different depending on how it ends. Um, my gut feeling is still that it is politically unacceptable for the European countries that Ukraine loses this war. Um, but the American government has changed so much in its approach since Donald Trump came to power, and um, it was. I think if there had been a continuation of what there was under the Biden administration, then sometime during this year, maybe toward the end of this year, it would be really difficult for the Russians to continue the war. Now I think they have better opportunities because the Ukraine will have fewer resources to fight with. I think in the end, it's probably still going to end with some kind of uh, situation where Russia has to give up on its ambitions of dominating Ukraine, all of Ukraine. But exactly how that is going to look, it's really difficult to say. And unfortunately, I think there are a lot of risks involved with that. I think it is possible that Russia is going to try to escalate their way out of that problem, and that they are going to try to do something to make it clear to the European countries what is really at stake. And that could, for example, be some kind of challenge of Article 5. And then, see if we will really be willing to commit to a fight when it comes to it. Um, so I do think it's a dangerous period ahead for the coming years for European security. This is a time when European security is being redefined. So the foundations of European security, the world order that has existed for 80 years, where the Americans were the guarantor of European security, that has ended. And and now that things are being redefined, that gives a moment of opportunity for someone like Russia to go in and try to take leadership and redefine that. And there's probably going to be some kind of struggle, where the Europeans have to also stand up for that and say, no, we have different values, and we are not going to let you decide what this looks like or who is in your sphere of influence. So it's really difficult to say exactly how the Ukraine war is going to end, but I can point to all kinds of uncertainties that could lead to escalation, unfortunately.
How do you feel about the perspective some people have saying Russia has been through one humiliation after the other in terms of the expansion of NATO? I mean, there's the whole quote of, I think it must have been between like Reagan and Gorbachev back then, that, will not move 1 inch to the east, which they have moved many thousand inches to the east in terms of NATO expansion. And so, I mean, I can kind of see how, as Russia, you would say, okay, we cannot have NATO on the borders, at least if you see them as a direct adversary. Do you think there's any merit to that point, and that you could say Russia are not being that aggressive and imperialistic? They just want some buffer.
No, I don't think those two things are contradictions. The way Russia sees NATO is through a lens of a great power. So it's a great power perspective they put on that. They see the world as consisting of the great powers and then a bunch of small states that orient themselves toward certain great powers. And they see NATO as the American group of small states. That's the American sphere of influence. So that is the big problem with NATO. They see it as the Americans stealing their small states and taking those small states that rightfully belong to Russia into the American sphere of influence. That's fundamentally what they see, and they want to rewind that development, right? So I don't. So on the one hand, yes, it is about NATO expansion, but on the other hand, it's also important to understand that it's also about Russian imperialism. It's also about Russia genuinely believing that they have a right to dominate over all those countries that were a part of the Warsaw Pact. I think that's sort of roughly in that neighborhood we're going to find the limits of where they think these things should go. Maybe not Eastern Germany, but the rest of the countries. I think they would see that this is rightfully ours to dominate. So I don't think that these things contradict each other. It's both about NATO expansion, but it's also about Russian imperialism.
So are you saying if Russia suddenly became super powerful, let's say they were 100% backed by China, or something major happened, do you think it would be realistic to see Russian tanks in Poland and the Czech Republic and the Baltic countries?
Absolutely. I think the way they are working on that is to try to undermine the coherence of NATO and see if they can somehow make NATO collapse as a useful international organization. And then if that happens, then all these countries are going to be left alone. So then it will be much easier for Russia to deal with it on a one-on-one basis, right? They will not be dealing with NATO. They will be dealing individually with Lithuania, right? So I think the Russian efforts here are going to be directed at how can we undermine NATO, the coherence of NATO, and unfortunately, I think it looks like they're doing pretty well on that right now. NATO is in the worst crisis it has ever been right now, with the Trump administration and the biggest military power basically telling everyone else that we're not going to be there for you, and that's why I'm so concerned that Russia might challenge Article 5, because that might be one more way to really put pressure on NATO and see if the countries really stand together when it comes to it, or if NATO is going to collapse, which I don't think we can rule out the possibility that is going to happen, because if there is some kind of violation of Article 5 and a bunch of NATO countries saying, "Yeah, you're on your own there, we're not going to honor our commitments here," then NATO is dead. And so I think that's the way they're going to try to deal with it, make NATO go away, and then after that, deal with all these countries on a one-by-one basis. Yeah.
But are you seeing Europe kind of shaping up? I mean, there was a lot of talk after Zelensky's humiliation, or what we should call it, in the Oval Office, where we talked about like the elevated role of Europe, and the UK and France would kind of lead it, and maybe later Germany when their parliament was more in place in the government. But then it has gone a little bit quiet. So I'm just unsure. Are these things continuing? Are they raising kind of the percentage that they'll use on military and defense to 3.5%, if not the 5% that Trump suggested? Or is it, once again, a lot of talk?
I don't think there is agreement between the European countries on that. Some countries are very concerned and really see the perspective that I've been talking about. Others are more relaxed about it and said, why would Russia do that? They don't want to do. So I don't know that there's agreement about it. I think we are definitely looking into a period where there will be growing defense budgets. More investments will be made. I think enough countries see the problems here and the dangers. The problem is, of course, that it takes a long time to build military capabilities. It's very easy to close them down, to say we don't need those capabilities anymore. It's a lot more difficult to build new ones, and that means there is right now going to be a period where Europe, there's just this, we just don't have the capabilities that are required. And then maybe in 10 or 20 years, we will be in a better position if we can navigate through those coming decades without this escalating. Then I think it looks better. But I think it's important we just recognize that being a bunch of different countries creates a vulnerability, because you need both capabilities, but you also need the will to use them and to suffer the casualties that you will be facing. And there will always be the temptation for those countries who are not directly threatened to say that, "Nah, it's not our war." And why would we fight this if we don't really have to, right? So I think it's important for our military might to be credible, to give credible deterrence, that we need to be not just on par with Russia, we need to be significantly better than Russia for this to be credible.
Which countries do you see being kind of the soft ones, just talking and maybe not ramping up, and which ones do you expect to be the hardliners, if we could call it that, who would ramp up budgets and capabilities?
I think the most important country right now is Germany, and the new German government is, but there are some positive signals coming out that they do see this, the challenge. So I think that's the most important country, both in terms of Europe as a whole, but definitely in terms of also our position here in the Baltic area. There is a large group of Southern European countries that don't see Russia as the big threat. And I think to some extent that is actually fair. I mean, I think it's important we don't get caught up in discussions about burden sharing and that meaning that nobody goes anywhere. The Southern European countries are facing different challenges, especially related to migration across the Mediterranean, for example. So they just have different security challenges as well that we need to take seriously as Northern Europeans, if we want them to take our concerns seriously, right? So I think that is something that it's important we don't get too caught up in these discussions about burden sharing, but that actually something happens and the investments are being made. Yeah.
And where would you position France in this? Because they've had very hard rhetorics towards Putin, but done a bit less, I suppose, than talked.
Yes and no. I mean, I think France is positioning right now themselves as being one of the key players in European security going forward, and also because they have insisted on strategic autonomy. So it's very much built around a French industrial base. They have their own nuclear weapons. They have not been sort of woven into an American sort of net of dependencies, right? And so they're one of the few countries that actually right now can point to what's happening and say, well, why didn't you listen to us before? Um, and they have also made decisions already like 7 or 8 years ago about how to grow their defense budgets toward 2030. So I think France has made some important decisions. I would say I'm actually a bit more, if I may. I think it's a little easier to be frustrated with the British actually because I think there is very much tough rhetoric from Britain, but I, I, I it, we don't see the investments being made on the British side, and I think that is going to be necessary. I really hope that we're going to be seeing more from that. I think um, uh, it's also when it comes to Ukraine, I think Britain has been very good at tough rhetoric, but I think when we look at the numbers, then they have been underperforming, and that's just not to say they're the only ones, but I think when we look at the kind of rhetoric that's been coming out of London, then I think that would have warranted a bit more in terms of actual investments.
So is what we need right now somebody to really support the Baltic countries? Is that the first priority, or is it equally Poland and maybe the Czech Republic that needs protection, or Romania, or
I think the Baltic states and Finland are the biggest problems. Poland has a very strong military, so I think they would probably be able to hold their own. And I think Finland has the benefit of having just bigger geography where it would be easier to think through this kind of idea of how can we reinforce that. I think the Baltic states are the most vulnerable in the sense that there is very, very little strategic depth. It wouldn't have to be very far that the Russians would need to go before they have the whole country, and there would be no place to reinforce anymore. So in that sense, I think the most important thing would be to reinforce the Baltic countries in the short term.
so? To kind of round this up, we've talked obviously a lot about Russia. Do you think in 20, 30 years we'll still be talking about Russia and the kind of fear of invasion, or do you think China will grow so much in terms of military, both soft and hard power, that we'll mainly be concerned about China maybe acting through Russia?
Well, or who knows? Maybe the United States are going to take Greenland, and they're going to be the new enemy. I It's hard to say. I mean, I think when it comes to China, then from a European perspective, we have the benefit of distance, which of course does not mean that conflicts do not touch us. But I mean, um, it is after all a different situation there. for us. China is a much bigger concern, I think, if you're a Southeast Asian country, right? Um, I think the Russian threat is. I don't think the way that Putin is running the Russian government is sustainable. I think we are looking into some kind of collapse at some point of that current Russian system, but that does not necessarily mean that things get better. And there is also a lot of concern about what will that look like. If we just play with the idea that Putin is still in power and there is a revolution in Russia, how will he deal with that? Right? I think it's pretty easy to imagine how he could react outwards and try to deal with that situation through a bigger war against us, for example. Right? So I I mean, there are definitely a lot of perspectives here that can be dangerous. But I think the most important thing is that we can somehow find a way to get through the coming years and toward a new understanding of a European security order where there are kind of rules of the game, right? In the end of the Cold War, there were also tensions, but there were also kind of rules of how do we go about things? How do we usually deal with the Russians in these kinds of situations? There were like, who can we call? Or, okay, we're going to have this kind of exercise now. We're going to give them a warning about it so they're not concerned, or like all these things, right? We need to this is going to sound strange, but we need to somehow get this hot war that is going on right now transformed over into a new Cold War. That would be a good ambition right now. We should not think about normalizing relations with Russia, going back to how things were in the early 2000s. That's not going to happen. But finding some way over in a new kind of Cold War situation where where people are not actually dying, that would be a good result at this point.
But nuclear weapons aside, it doesn't really seem that Russia is an equal adversary to the West.
Yeah, but that's why I said the Russia's goal is going to be to get NATO to break apart, and after that has happened, they can deal with all the countries individually. And Russia is a huge power compared to everyone in Eastern Europe, right? And even even if you take someone Russia against Germany, for example, Russia would still be in a much better position in case of a war, right? So the goal, I think it's um, unless we can address this question of alliance cohesion in the West and make sure that the idea of breaking apart NATO would be outrageous. But right now it's not an outrageous thought that this could actually happen. And in that case, it's not unrealistic that Russia can assert themselves as this great power if they can manage to do that, because then that's a whole totally different comparison.
But do you think there will be kind of a new pact then between Russia and China? Maybe sort of a Warsaw Pact, but with China being the big brother?
I I think in the long term, it's probably not sustainable, the relationship that Russia and China have. And there are going to be more and more conflicts there. Um, they don't actually share many views on anything. The only thing they really share is this vision of a multipolar world where the United States is removed from the pedestal, and once that has happened, then I don't really see Russia and China having all that much in common anymore. Um, so I think in the long term, I don't think we're going to see a Russia-Chinese alliance or close relationship like that. It's going to be a much more ad hoc kind of interest-based relationship. And to be clear, the Chinese don't care at all about whatever Russia does in Europe. It's the Chinese don't care who controls Ukraine. It's not. I mean, who gets what city or it's not their concern at all. So they don't have anything ideologically there to align with Russia about.
Yes. I mean, it seems there are some alliances that are more based on whom you hate than whom you have things in common with. I mean, the economic alliance of BRICS plus, where I'm always saying, it doesn't make a lot of sense that Brazil and Iran can be in the same alliance. There's not a lot of samba going on in Iran.
No.
But I've been visiting some of these countries, and they take it very seriously. I mean, they celebrate the BRICS alliance. Maybe not so much Brazil, but especially like, for example, in India and Pakistan, even though Pakistan, I guess, are not a part of it. Then they're like, no, this is big, and we need to be this kind of counterpart and adversary to the US. They're so excited about that. So I'm also thinking, like, you cannot keep these group of countries coherent, but apparently if they have an enemy they agree on, it's easier. But do you see that as a strategy for Russia and China?
Yeah, but that's actually why it's kind of ironic that right now Donald Trump seems really enthusiastic about building a new relationship with Russia and having a reset there, and maybe they can work together. And he wants to do a reverse Nixon where it's Russia and China going forward against, or it's the United States and Russia, and then separate them from China. There is not that much interest in that from the Russians, right? Because they actually need the United States to play this role of the adversary. As you say, the whole idea of the BRICS alliance is very much to be a counterweight to American power. And if the Americans want to join that, well, that kind of breaks the point, right? There's nothing to hold this together. So that's I think it's so unpredictable right now what's happening in the international system, where we have both we have this transformation to a multipolar world, definitely American decline. The Americans don't have the power they used to have, and that is accelerated by Donald Trump. And at this point, I think it's even unpredictable in this multipolar world. How are Europe and the United States going to be aligned in this? And are we going to see new formations appear? So many open questions. That's also why we started by talking about how technology is driving conflict. Now we are here with politics also driving more conflict. So unfortunately, that's another reason why it's a turbulent period we're entering.
So I guess we can conclude one thing, that it's a very unpredictable world at the moment.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of scary. I guess it is also, I think, interesting at the same time. But there are definitely multiple outcomes with both robotics, artificial intelligence storming forward, China becoming a bigger and bigger factor. And Russia still somehow being a power, even though their economy is a lot smaller than Germany. But thank you so much for joining, Anders. It was a true pleasure.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
We are living in dangerous and unpredictable times, geopolitically, technologically, and socially. But understanding the future is the first step to navigating it. If you found this episode valuable, check out the next 2 videos we've handpicked for you. Both dive deep into the future of AI and the changing world order. Subscribe for more episodes that unpack the future. This is the Mindblowers Podcast. See you soon.